The desert was silent. The air was dry and heavy, carrying dust that clung to the skin and burned in the throat. Nothing moved in the ruins of the old settlement. The wooden buildings stood broken and tired, leaning under the weight of time. A single chain rattled in the wind, a sound sharp enough to cut through the silence. And she was there, an alien girl, standing in the middle of the square. Her skin glowed faintly blue under the hot sun. Her golden eyes stared forward, unblinking, as if she had forgotten how to look away. Heavy iron chains wrapped around her arms, chest, and neck. The metal was old and rusted, but strong enough to hold her in place. Every time she moved, even the smallest step, the chains bit into her skin. She did not cry. She did not scream. She had stopped doing that long ago. People passed her without care. To them, she was nothing but a slave, a tool to be used, laughed at, or ignored. Her value was measured only in pain. If she fell, they pulled her up only to chain her tighter. If she resisted, they beat her until her body shook and her breath came out weak and broken. To them, she was dirt, but inside, something still lived. A spark too small to see, too stubborn to die. The sun burned above her, and sweat mixed with dust on her face. Her lips were cracked, her throat dry. She had been standing there since morning, on display, as if her suffering was some kind of entertainment. The crowd that had once gathered to mock her had long since grown bored. Only a few children lingered, throwing pebbles, laughing when she refused to react. She did not give them the pleasure of seeing her break. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. She remembered a time when she had run free, a time before the chains. It was like a dream now, faint and distant. The sound of rivers, the warmth of her people's songs, the touch of her mother's hand on her cheek. All of it stolen, all of it gone. What remained was this desert, this silence, and the constant weight of iron. The wind picked up, and with it came the sharp smell of rust and sand. The chain clinked louder, echoing off the broken walls of the settlement. Her hair whipped against her face, but she did not move. She could not move. Every movement was a reminder of the life she no longer had. But in her eyes, there was still something dangerous, not fear, not despair. Defiance. The people who owned her believed they had broken her spirit, but they were wrong. Deep inside, hidden beneath pain and silence, was a will they could not touch. She was chained, yes. She was treated like dirt, yes. But she was not defeated. Not yet. The sky above her shifted as a single cloud passed, casting a shadow over the desert floor. For a moment, the heat lessened. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. The shadow felt like a promise, though she could not explain why. Something was coming. Something different. She could feel it in the air, in the way the silence seemed to wait. The settlement itself seemed to sense it too. The laughter of children faded. The streets grew still. Even the wind slowed, as if holding its breath. Her eyes narrowed, and then she heard its footsteps. Slow, steady, and unlike the hurried shuffle of her captors or the careless steps of passers-by. These footsteps carried weight, a calm strength that did not belong in this place. She turned her head just slightly, the chains groaning against her skin. Through the dust, she saw a figure, a human. He walked with quiet confidence, his gaze scanning the broken buildings before falling on her. His eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, the world seemed to shift. For the first time in years, someone looked at her and did not see dirt. He did not laugh. He did not mock. He simply looked. The chain rattled again, loud in the silence, as if it to sense the change. She did not know him. She did not know what he wanted. But his presence was different in a way that made her chest tighten and her breath quicken. The desert had always been the same, endless, cruel, and empty. But now, with this human standing before her, it felt like something new had entered her story. Something dangerous. Something powerful. Something that might finally break the chains in the dust. The sun climbed higher, and the heat pressed down like a heavy hand. The girl's body ached, every bone reminding her of the chains that bound her. Around her, life in the settlement went on, cruel and careless. Traders shouted at one another, their voices sharp as they bargained over scraps of food and rusted metal. A woman dragged a child through the dust, pulling too hard when the child resisted. A group of men laughed as they threw dice in the shade of a broken wall. ignoring her as if she were a piece of wood or stone. This was her world, a place without mercy. For as long as she could remember, she had been treated like an object, not a living being. She was property, a thing to be owned, beaten, and forgotten. To her captors, her suffering was ordinary, not worth noticing. If she cried out in pain, no one turned their head. If she bled, no one cared enough to wipe the blood away. She had been raised in this desert of cruelty, where compassion was weaker than sand, and where kindness was spoken of only in myths. Yet deep inside, she had never fully surrendered. Each day she asked herself the same question: why am I still alive? And every day, though she had no answer, she felt the faintest whisper that perhaps her life still held a meaning. That whisper, though fragile, was enough to keep her from collapsing into nothingness. Her eyes wandered over the settlement. She had seen it countless times: the cracked walls, the rotting wood, the piles of broken machinery no one cared to fix. But today it felt different. Today, she felt as though everything around her was holding its breath. The air itself carried tension, as if the desert was waiting for something to happen. The footsteps from earlier still echoed in her mind. A human had entered. That alone was strange. Humans rarely came to this part of the desert. When they did, they kept their distance, unwilling to step into a place so ruled by cruelty. They were outsiders here, and most who came left quickly. But this one had not left. She thought of his eyes, the way he had looked at her, steady, clear, and strangely gentle. It was not the gaze of a man buying meat or tools. It was something else, something she had never seen before. It unsettled her, because it made her wonder, could someone really see her as more than a slave? The men gambling nearby noticed the human too. They called out to him with mocking voices, offering to sell him worthless junk, shouting prices that made no sense. He ignored them. His steps carried him closer to her, and each one sent a shiver through her chest. Her chains rattled as she shifted slightly, uncertain whether to stand tall or lower her head. She chose to keep her eyes forward. Pride was the only thing she had left, and she would not surrender it, not even to him. He stopped only a few feet away. Dust swirled around his boots as he looked up at her, his face calm, unreadable. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, loud against the silence that had fallen over the square. The owner of the slaves stepped forward then, a heavy-set man with a scar running down his cheek. His laugh was rough, almost cruel, as he slapped the chain with his hand. "You looking at this one?" he asked the human. "She's no good. Broken too many times. Doesn't fight anymore, doesn't beg either. Worthless." The words stung, though she forced her face to remain still. She had been called worse before. She had learned to let insults fall like dust. But hearing them now, with the human standing there, felt different. She wanted, for reasons she could not explain, for him not to believe them. The human did not answer right away. He studied her for a long moment. His eyes moved from the chains to her arms, to her face, and finally back to her eyes. It was not the cruel inspection of a buyer deciding whether she was strong enough to work. It was almost as if he was trying to see who she really was beneath the dirt and rust. Finally, he spoke. His voice was steady and low, yet it carried across the square. "How much?" The laughter that followed was loud and mocking. The gamblers shouted insults, children pointed, and even the owner smirked. They called the human a fool, a wasteful outsider throwing away his wealth on something useless. One man shouted that he should buy a real tool, not a piece of broken property. But the human didn't flinch. He pulled something from his pocket, a bag of credits, heavier than any ordinary traveler would carry. He tossed it to the owner without a second thought. The sound of metal coins clinking together silenced the laughter for a brief second. The owner's eyes lit up with greed. He didn't care what the human wanted. He didn't care if the girl lived or died. He cared only for the weight of the bag now in his hands. "She's yours," he said quickly, already turning away to count the money. The human reached up and touched the chain. For a heartbeat, she wanted to pull back. She had been touched too many times by hands that only brought pain. But this was different. His touch was firm, not cruel, and in a single motion, he began to loosen the iron from around her neck. The weight she had carried for so long fell into the dust with a crash, for the first time in years. Her chest felt light. She drew in a deep breath, as if the air itself had changed. Her arms trembled as the chains were removed, and her knees nearly gave way under the sudden freedom. She caught herself, forcing her body to stand tall, even though her heart was racing wildly. The people of the settlement stared, whispering in disbelief. They had expected the human to mock her, to treat her the same as everyone else had. Instead, he had freed her. And in that moment, though she could not yet understand why, the world she knew began to crack open. The chains were gone, but the weight of them still pressed against her skin like a shadow that refused to leave. The girl stood frozen, her arms trembling as if they did not know what to do with freedom. The metal lay in the dust at her feet, broken pieces of a life she had never chosen. Around her, whispers spread like fire. No one understood what had just happened. A human had come into their settlement, and instead of mocking her, instead of treating her as dirt, he had freed her. The crowd stared at him with disbelief, as if waiting for the trick to reveal itself. But the human stood calmly beside her, his presence solid and unshaken. He did not look at the others. He did not answer their jeers. His eyes stayed on her, steady and focused, as if she was the only one that mattered in that square full of voices. She felt her throat tighten. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She had forgotten the sound of her own voice long ago. What could she say to him? She did not even know why he had done it. The owner of the slaves was already counting his coins, laughing to himself as if the trade meant nothing. To him, she had been useless, broken beyond repair. He never once looked back at her, and that, more than the chains, reminded her of how little her life had meant here. The human finally moved. He gestured for her to follow, his hand steady but not forceful. It was not a command, not the order of a master to his property. It was an invitation. She stared at his hand for a long moment, uncertain if she should take a step. Her legs were weak. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and something she did not recognize. Something dangerously close to hope. The crowd's whispers grew louder. "She won't move," someone said. "She's too broken." Another voice sneered. "He'll regret it." They all break in the end. Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. The same sound she had lived with for years, but the human ignored them. He waited patiently, his eyes never leaving hers. Slowly, with hesitation in every step, she began to move. Her feet dragged at first, heavy as if the chains still clung to her ankles. Then, step by step, she reached his side. When she finally stood next to him, the murmurs of the crowd turned to silence. Together, they began to walk. The dust swirled around them as they left the square behind. No one tried to stop them. The owner had his coins, and the others had their laughter. But their laughter now carried unease, for they could not understand what they had just witnessed. A human had taken a slave. Yes, but he had not treated her like a slave. And that, to them, was a strange and dangerous thing. She kept glancing at him as they walked. He was quiet, his steps steady, his face unreadable. Who was he? Why had he done this? Her mind searched for answers, but none came. All she knew was that she no longer felt the sting of iron on her skin, and for that alone, she could not look away from him. The path out of the settlement stretched before them, empty and long. The sun beat down hard, and the wind pulled at her hair. She stumbled once, her knees threatening to give way, but his hand reached out quickly, catching her arm before she fell. His grip was firm, not cruel, steadying her without force. She blinked at him, surprised, and for a second, she felt the strange warmth of being protected rather than controlled. Her voice returned in a whisper, broken and raw. "Why?" The word left her lips before she could stop it. She had not spoken for so long that the sound startled even herself. She repeated it, louder this time, though her voice cracked. "Why, me?" The human's eyes softened, though his face remained calm. "Because you are not what they say you are," he said simply. The words struck her like a blow, but not the kind she had known all her life. This one did not bruise her body, it cracked something inside her heart. No one had ever said that before. No one had ever even suggested she was more than what her captors believed. Her breath shook, and she lowered her gaze, afraid of what might show in her eyes. She did not know if she could believe him. She did not know if she dared to believe him. They walked further, leaving behind the voices and the laughter. The desert stretched wide around them, endless and merciless, yet she felt it differently now. It was still harsh, still filled with heat and silence, but with each step beside him, it seemed less empty. Her body remained weak. Her chains might have been gone, but their memory lingered. And yet, for the first time, she felt something rise inside her that she had not known in years. A small, fragile flame. Hope. It terrified her more than the chains ever had. She looked again at the human walking beside her, and she realized that whatever came next, her life would never return to what it was. The chains and the dust were behind her, and ahead, though uncertain, was something entirely new. And deep inside, she began to wonder if perhaps fate had placed this stranger in her path for a reason. The desert stretched wide and empty, the sand glowing under the weight of the afternoon sun. The girl walked beside the human, her bare feet sinking softly into the dust. Each step felt strange. For so long, her movements had been guided by chains, pulled and pushed by others. But now she walked freely. The sensation was both terrifying and unreal. She kept glancing at her wrists where the iron had once cut into her skin, half expecting the chains to return at any moment. Behind them, the settlement grew smaller until it was just a shadow in the haze. The voices, the laughter, the cruel eyes, they all faded into silence. Yet, even as the world behind her disappeared, she could still hear the echo of their words in her mind. Worthless, broken, dirt. Words she had lived under for years. She tightened her jaw and forced herself to keep walking, though her body trembled with weakness. The human said little. His steps were calm, his eyes always forward, scanning the horizon. There was something in his silence that unsettled her. He had freed her, but he had not explained why. Was she truly free, or had she only exchanged one kind of chain for another? She studied him carefully, searching for a sign of cruelty hidden beneath his calm exterior, but found none. His face was steady, his movements purposeful, as if he carried a strength that did not need to prove itself with violence. The sun burned hotter, and her legs shook with exhaustion. Her throat was dry, her breaths uneven. She stumbled again, and once more his hand reached out to steady her. He gave her water from a small container he carried. She hesitated before drinking, afraid it was a trick, but his gaze was firm and without mockery. Slowly, she lifted it to her lips. The water was warm, but it slid down her throat like life itself. For a moment, she closed her eyes and felt something she had almost forgotten: relief. When she opened her eyes again, he was still watching her, not with pity, not with disgust, but with something harder to name. She set the container back into his hand and lowered her gaze, unsure of how to respond. Hours passed in silence. The desert was endless, the sky unbroken, the wind carrying dust across the barren ground. The girl's mind wandered back to the settlement. She could still see the faces of those who had laughed at her suffering, their voices sharp and cruel. She wondered if they would even remember her tomorrow. To them, she had never been a person, only a thing to mock, to break, to forget. But to this human, what was she now? At last, as the horizon darkened with the promise of evening, he stopped. He set down a small pack, pulling out supplies with practiced ease. A small fire was built, its flames fragile against the endless sky. He handed her food, simple and plain, but enough to fill the hollow ache in her stomach. She stared at it for a long moment, unable to believe it was truly meant for her. "You need to eat," he said quietly. The sound of his voice startled her. She had grown used to his silence, and hearing him speak again made her heart quicken. She nodded slowly and ate in small, cautious bites. The food tasted strange after so long with nothing, but she forced herself to keep going. When the fire crackled and the dessert cooled, she finally found her voice. It was rough, low, but steady enough to form the question that had burned inside her since he had first touched her. "Chains. Why did you take me?" The human's eyes lifted from the fire. For a moment, he did not answer. Then, calmly, he said, "Because no one deserves to live as you did." Her chest tightened. The words seemed impossible. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. She wanted to believe him, but the years of cruelty behind her made it hard. She stared at him, waiting for the trick, the laughter, the cruelty she knew so well. But it never came. "You are not dirt," he added. "You are not broken." The flames flickered between them, and she felt the heat rise in her chest. Not from the fire, but from something deeper. It frightened her more than the chains ever had. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her as if she mattered. She looked away quickly, hiding her face in the shadows. She did not want him to see the tears threatening her eyes. She hated herself for feeling weak, yet she could not stop the flood of emotions. The desert was silent except for the crackle of fire and the soft whisper of wind. She sat with him, unsure of what tomorrow would bring, but knowing that her world had already changed. The chains lay behind her in the dust, forgotten by those who had placed them there. Ahead of her stretched a path she could not yet see, but she knew she would not walk it alone. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had been chosen for something more. The night passed slowly, with the fire crackling low and the stars watching silently from above. She did not sleep much. Every time she closed her eyes, she expected to feel chains again, to hear the harsh laugh of her owner, to wake with pain pressing against her wrists. But the night stayed calm. The human had rested near the fire, his back straight, his breathing steady. He did not chain her, did not shout at her, did not treat her as property. He simply rested, as if her presence beside him was nothing unusual. When the first light of dawn touched the desert, she rose slowly. Her legs were weak, but lighter than the day before. The weight that had always pulled her down was gone. She lifted her arms carefully, almost not believing the freedom was real. The air touched her skin where metal had once cut. She held her breath, afraid that if she moved too quickly, the dream would end and the chains would return. The human stirred and opened his eyes. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable, but there was no cruelty in it. He offered her a piece of bread from his pack. She hesitated, then took it, eating slowly. Each bite felt like a victory, like proof that her suffering was not all there was. As the sun climbed higher, they set out again. The desert stretched wide and endless, but her steps felt different. For the first time, she walked without being pulled or forced. The human did not push her, did not drag her forward. He simply walked beside her, his pace steady, as if her presence was enough. At first, the silence was heavy. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but her voice felt broken, unused. Yet the thoughts in her head were louder than the wind. Why had he freed her? What did he want from her? Could she trust him? She did not know. But each time she glanced at him, his calm gaze gave her no reason to fear. Hours passed, and they stopped near a cluster of rocks for shade. She sat, her back against the stone, feeling the coolness sink into her skin. The human gave her water again, and this time she took it without hesitation. She was learning that he did not offer pain in disguise. Her eyes wandered over the horizon. She had never really looked at the desert before. It had always been her prison, a place where her chains kept her eyes low and her spirit broken. But now, with her arms free, she noticed the beauty hidden in the emptiness. The colors of the sand shifted under the sun, gold blending into red and brown. The sky above was endless, alive with light. Even the wind felt different, carrying not just dust but the promise of something beyond. She closed her eyes and let the breeze touch her face. It was a small thing, but to her it felt like the first true breath of her life. For years, she had been trapped in the same circle of pain and humiliation. Now she was outside that circle, standing on the edge of something new. When she opened her eyes, she found the human watching her again. His gaze was steady, but not harsh. She looked away quickly, embarrassed by the heat rising in her chest. No one had ever looked at her like that, not as dirt, not as property, but as if she were real. The thought frightened her. Hope was dangerous. Hope could break harder than chains when it was taken away. But still, she could not stop the small flame growing inside her. As they continued walking, she began to test her freedom. She lifted her arms high, stretching them toward the sky. The chains were not there. She bent down to touch the sand, letting the grains slip through her fingers. No one struck her for moving without permission. She walked ahead a few steps, then back, just to feel the choice of direction. Each movement was simple, yet it filled her with wonder. The human said nothing, but she noticed the faintest curve at the corner of his lips, as if he understood what she was doing. By the time the sun began to fall, painting the desert in orange and gold, she felt stronger than she had in years. Her body was still weak, but her spirit had begun to rise. She was no longer just a slave. She was someone who could breathe, someone who could choose when they stopped for the night. She sat by the fire and finally spoke again, her voice rough but stronger than before. "I was nothing," she whispered, staring into the flames. "They told me every day. They made me believe it." The human looked at her across the fire. His voice was calm, certain. "You were never nothing." Her heart pounded at his words. She wanted to believe them, but the scars on her body reminded her of the lies she had been forced to live. Still, hearing them out loud, spoken so simply, planted a seed she could not ignore. She pulled her knees close, resting her chin on them. The desert night was cold, but for the first time, she felt a warmth inside her that did not come from fire. The chains had been cut, but now something greater was beginning to break the belief that she was worthless. And as she closed her eyes, the thought stayed with her. Maybe this was not just freedom. Maybe this was the beginning of becoming someone more than she had ever imagined. The days that followed moved slowly, but each one carried something new. She had been freed from the chains, yet the weight of them still lingered in her mind. At night, she dreamed of the clinking iron, of voices mocking her, of cruel hands pulling her down. She woke in fear, her body tense, her eyes searching for the chains that were no longer there. Each time she opened her eyes and found the human sitting by the fire, silent and watchful. She felt the fear ease just a little more. Trust did not come easily. Her life had been built on betrayal and cruelty. She had learned to keep her heart locked away, to never believe a kind word, to never expect mercy. But the human never shouted, never struck her, never used her. He walked with her during the day and rested quietly at night. He gave her food and water without demand. He treated her as if she mattered. And slowly, against her will, she began to wonder if she could trust him. One afternoon, when the sun was softer and the desert air carried a cooler wind, she spoke again. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "Why do you not treat me like they did?" The human glanced at her. His eyes were calm, steady, but filled with a depth she could not understand. "Because you are not theirs," he said simply. "You are not dirt. You are someone." The words cut through her like sunlight breaking into a dark cave. She looked away quickly, afraid of how much they stirred inside her. Could it be true? Could she really be more than what they had told her? For years, her identity had been shaped by pain and cruelty. To imagine herself as someone felt impossible. Yet when she walked beside him, when she heard his steady voice, she felt the faintest spark of belief. As the days stretched on, her body began to change too. The weakness that had once defined her gave way to small strength. Her steps grew steadier, her arms moved without trembling. She stretched them wide sometimes, testing the freedom that was still new to her. She lifted stones, carried water, even dared to run a short distance when the desert path was smooth. Each small action reminded her that she was no longer broken. The human watched without judgment. He did not stop her, did not mock her. When she stumbled, he helped her up. When she succeeded, he gave a quiet nod, as if acknowledging something important. His silence was not empty, it was steady ground, a presence that let her test herself without fear. At night, as they sat by the fire, she began to ask questions. About him, about his people, about why he had come to the settlement. He answered in his calm way, never giving too much detail, but always enough to make her think. He spoke of places she had never seen, of stars she had never looked at closely, of lives lived with dignity instead of chains. His words painted pictures in her mind, pictures of a world beyond the desert, a world she had never dared to imagine. One night, when the flames danced high, she whispered, "Do you think I could ever be more?" He looked at her for a long time, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "You already are," he said. Her breath caught. She wanted to deny it, to say that he was wrong. But deep inside, something in her heart leapt at those words. For years she had been told she was worthless, and she had believed it. Now, with every word he spoke, with every step she took beside him, that belief cracked further. Still, fear clung to her. Hope was dangerous. She had seen others crushed when hope was stolen from them. She did not want to suffer that again. But the human's presence was steady, and each day with him made it harder to hold on to the fear. One evening, As the desert sky turned purple with twilight, they came across a small stream hidden between rocks. The sound of water running was strange to her ears, almost magical. She knelt beside it, touching the cool surface with shaking hands. For the first time in years, she felt clean water on her skin. She splashed it against her face, laughing softly without meaning to. The sound startled her. It had been so long since she had heard her own laughter. The human smiled faintly, but said nothing. He let her have the moment, as if he knew how important it was. That night, as she lay by the fire, she thought about the chains. She remembered the weight, the pain, the way they had shaped her life. But now she realized something. The chains were gone, and she was still here, still breathing, still alive. And with every step she took, she was becoming someone new. Trust was still hard. Fear still whispered in the dark. But now there was something louder, something brighter growing inside her. A feeling she had almost forgotten. Hope. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hold onto it. The desert night was quiet. The fire burned low, throwing faint shadows across the sand. She sat with her knees drawn close, staring into the fading flames. The warmth against her face reminded her she was still alive, still breathing, still free. But more than that, it reminded her of how much had changed in such a short time. Once, her world had been nothing but chains, mocking laughter, and pain. She had been told she was worthless, that her life meant nothing, that her only purpose was to obey. Now, as the firelight flickered, she realized those words no longer held her. The chains were gone, and something else had taken their place, something she had thought she would never feel again. She lifted her eyes toward the stars. They stretched endlessly across the sky, brighter than she had ever noticed before. For years, she had kept her gaze low, forced down by iron and cruelty. Now she could look up, and the sight filled her chest with something she could not name. It was too big to be fear, too strong to be doubt. It was possibility. The human sat across from her, quiet as always, his face calm in the glow of the fire. He did not stare at her, did not demand her attention. Yet his presence was like a steady wall at her back, strong, certain, unshakable. She wanted to ask him more, to understand why he had chosen her. But the words tangled inside her throat. Instead, she whispered the thought that had lived in her since the day he had freed her. What will I become now? The fire popped softly, and for a long moment he did not answer. Then, in his steady voice, he said, "Whatever you choose." The simplicity of the answer struck her harder than any blow she had ever taken. Choice. It was a word she had never been allowed to claim. She had been born into chains, forced into pain, denied every decision. And now, with one sentence, he had given her the thing she thought she would never have. Her heart beat faster. Could she truly choose? Could she truly decide who she was, where she would go, what she would become? The thought was terrifying, but it also filled her with fire. The following days carried them further from the settlement. The horizon opened wider, and the world seemed to stretch beyond the edges of everything she had ever known. Each step became easier. Each breath carried less fear. The scars on her wrists still burned, but now they were reminders of what she had overcome rather than marks of what held her down. Sometimes she stumbled when the memories returned too sharply. She remembered the jeers, the blows, the endless shame. But the human was always there, steady and quiet. He did not erase the memories, but he gave her something else to stand on. And little by little, the past began to loosen its grip. One afternoon, as the sun painted the sand in shades of gold, she stopped walking. She closed her eyes, lifted her arms high into the air, and let the wind wash over her face. For years, the air had been stale, filled with the stench of rust and chains. Now it carried freedom. She laughed softly again, her voice shaking but real. The human glanced at her, and this time, he smiled. It was small, almost hidden, but she saw it. And that smile told her everything. He believed in her, even when she did not yet fully believe in herself. At night, she began to dream differently. No longer of chains and cruelty, but of paths yet to be walked. She dreamed of rivers, of mountains, of stars so close they seemed alive. She dreamed of being more than a slave, more than dirt, more than forgotten. She dreamed of becoming whole. The fear never vanished completely. It whispered in the corners of her mind, warning her that hope was fragile, that everything could still be taken away. But now she had something stronger to hold onto, trust, and with trust came courage. One evening, as they rested by a small fire, she spoke again. Her voice was stronger than before, though still soft. "You changed my life." The human looked at her, his eyes steady. "No," he said gently. "You changed your own. I only gave you the chance." Her breath caught at his words. She realized he was right. He had broken the chains, but she was the one who had chosen to step forward, to walk, to breathe, to live. The strength had been inside her all along, waiting to be found. The desert stretched before them, vast and endless, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like the beginning of a road, one that could lead anywhere. She did not know where it would take her, or what she would face along the way. But she knew one thing with certainty. She would never again be what they had called her. She was not dirt. She was not broken. She was someone, and with each step beside the human, she felt herself becoming more than she had ever imagined possible. The chains were gone. The laughter of her captors was behind her. Ahead of her was a new story, one that was hers to tell. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to begin.